It's a great pleasure for me to introduce one of my closest friends, Ken Jowitt, on this occasion. His lecture, as you know, is entitled The Humvee and the Apple Tree, Globalization or Americanization. And I understand Thomas Friedman's lawyers are looking for you as we speak. Ken Jowitt is currently both the Press and Maureen Hotchkiss Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and the Robeson Professor of Political Science Emeritus here at Berkeley, which means he has the best of two worlds, a Stanford salary and a Berkeley parking pass. But let me say something more serious about Ken's background. Ken received his bachelor's degree from Columbia University in 1962 and his PhD here at the University of California, Berkeley in 1970. He was a professor of political science at Berkeley from 1968 until his retirement in 2002, which is a period I just learned about as long as Professor Moses' tenure as professor of political science. Ken at Berkeley had an extraordinary career both as a scholar, a teacher, and even as an administrator. He was briefly Dean of Undergraduate Studies here. He has written many acclaimed books and articles specializing in comparative politics and social theory. Among these books are The New World Order, The Leninist Extinction, published in 1992. This book was characteristically contrarian initially, and now conventional wisdom, as he took the position that the post-Soviet transition to democracy would be nasty and brutish, and also certainly not short. Among his notable articles with wonderful titles have been In Praise of the Ordinary, an essay on democracy, Moscow Center, Gorbachev, Bolshevik or Menshevik, and my personal favorite, Weber, Trotsky, and Holmes, by whom he meant Sherlock Holmes, not Oliver Wendell Holmes, or even more recently, Johnny Holmes. Ken was a popular and renowned teacher who won virtually all of the campus's teaching awards, including the University Distinguished Teaching Award and the very first social science large undergraduate class teaching award. He supervised more than 20 doctoral dissertations and now has former students and acolytes scattered in distinguished departments in the United States, Europe, and Asia. Finally, as today's event testifies, Ken is a much sought-after speaker at universities and other professional settings, and we'll soon find out why. He has given the Princeton University Lecture Series in 1998 and was the Jean Monnet Visiting Scholar at the European University in Florence a year later. This leads me to suspect that he accepts these gigs where they have good wine cellars. So we'll have to see whether UC Berkeley's post-lecture dinner meets your high standards, but there's no doubt that your lecture will meet our highest standards. So it's with great pleasure I turn over the floor to Ken Jowitt.
It is nice to be part of this tradition, extending back to before I was born. It is a compliment to be invited to give this talk. And it was a surprise and a delight to have my dear friend and distinguished colleague, Jack Citrin, introduce me. After communism's collapse and before 9/11, the dominant theme in America was a Fukuyama-based optimism about the end of history. The dominant idiom was globalization, the dominant domain, information technology, and the dominant phrase was no boundaries, one used in every possible context, including SUV ads. There was a widely and enthusiastically shared sense that we were at a revolutionary historical moment equivalent to the industrial and national revolutions of the 19th century. No one expressed this more fluently, popularly, and mistakenly than Tom Friedman of the New York Times in his book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. The title says as much as the book itself. It suggests a cosmopolitan world, a Kantian world economy and society whose local connections would be ideally limited to the sanitized elements of ethnic identity. A world where everyone from Brooklyn to Bolivia, Bulgaria to Bangladesh would drive to their respective big fat Greek weddings in a Lexus. And then in a single day, the apparently inexorable historical thrust toward a world of universal Western economics and colorful, not dangerous ethnics, was overturned. In quick succession, Americans were presented with a different idiom, the war on terrorism and axis of evil. With the invasion of Iraq, the dominant domain became military, not information technology. The dominant terms became freedom and democratization, and the implicit reference shifted from Silicon Valley to Valley Forge. Should Friedman issue a revised version of the Lexus and the olive tree, a better title would be the Humvee and the apple tree, reflecting the fact that today globalization is almost as American as apple pie. The current attempt to make globalization identical to Americanization is vividly captured in the Bush administration's phrase, regime change. Political, cultural, social, and economic changes to be accomplished militarily by the United States and coalitions of the willing, not a la Friedman by the golden straitjacket and the electronic herd. Once again, Lenin has trumped Marx. The pre-11 Bush administration followed the Clinton administration's Marxist Fukuyama belief in the inexorable historical unfolding of a world with a democratic capitalist America as its leading and compelling exemplar. Transitions to democracy were believed to be the political logos for this philosophical change and the ending of history as we know it. Prior to 9/11, Condoleezza Rice, the current National Security Advisor, wrote in Foreign Affairs that Iraq was living on borrowed time and there was no need to panic. 9/11 made Bush and his administration Leninists. The 9/11 attacks made it clear to the Bush administration that the inexorable unfolding of history in America's favor was unfounded and dangerous. A very correct conclusion. The Bush administration concluded that Fukuyama and Friedman's historical timetables were too laissez-faire, not nearly attentive enough to the levers of historical change. Like Lenin, Bush decided that history needs deliberate organization, deliberate direction, and in some instances, imposed change. And so, after 9/11, the comfortable notion that the United States would naturally emerge as the most concrete example without the use of force, leading the way to a global society that would transcend the current institutions we now have, and that the mechanism for this would be the rather mundane theory, but nevertheless supposed historical reality of transitions to democracy. After 9/11, the Bush administration made a conclusion, came to a conclusion, and when politicians come to a conclusion, it's not necessarily more interesting, it's simply more important than when academics come to a conclusion. The Bush administration decided transitions to democracy would be replaced by impositions of democracy. The decisive issue then, in the early 21st century, is not the end of history, nor is it the clash of civilizations, nor is it globalization per se, rather it is the relationship between Americanization and globalization. The critical question today is whether or not the United States continues to pursue what is in effect a papal identification of Americanization and globalization, or whether America defines our global position and role in a more relative ecumenical way. Since 9/11, the answer is clearly the former. The consequences are nowhere nearly as clear, but most likely will be negative for us and the world. I will examine the current papal identification of Americanization and globalization from three perspectives. I just want to make sure you're clear, or at least you know you're unclear about what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that before Martin Luther, to be Christian in Western Europe, you had to be a Catholic. In other words, Roman Catholicism assimilated the general reality of Christianity to the particular definition of being Roman Christian. After Luther, you could be a Christian without being a Catholic. The United States is trying to be a Roman Catholic. It is saying, in effect, that there's a thing out there called globalization, and it's not simply that we're one part of it and the leading part of it and the most influential and powerful part of it, but in effect, since 9/11, what we're trying to say is we define what globalization is. I'm going to look at this from three perspectives. First, historically. To begin with, for ideologies, for religions, and for political movements, with the potential to become the practical basis of a new way of life on a global scale. Let me make that clear. For religions, political movements, for ideologies with the potential to become the practical basis of a new way of life on a global scale. They must have their institutional character and signature politically monopolized by a single authoritative entity for a strategic period of time. What do I mean by that? Bulgarian nationalism has no potential to be universal. I mean, once you hit all the Bulgarians, that's it. Islam has the potential to be universal. Liberalism had the potential. Christianity had the potential. What I am arguing is that for any religion, political movement, or ideology with the potential to become a practical universal reality, it must be politically monopolized, concretely defined and disciplined by a single authoritative center for a strategic period of time, or it will never become universal. In short, for those grand universal global things we like, you need a period basically of authoritarian centralization. Now, take Rome and Christianity. For an institutionally strategic and critical period of time, Rome was, as I've just pointed out, Christianity. Rome was not simply a major form or representation of Christianity. It had been that up until the 4th century. But in fact, Eastern Christianity with Clement and Origen, North African Christianity with Tertullian and Augustine, they had been competitors. It's only beginning in the 4th century that Rome makes a compelling, practical, authoritative claim to discipline and define what it means to be Christian. And it put it in very practical terms in the form of the Mass, the sacraments, the role of the priest, and the status of the Pope. For an historically strategic and critical period of time, England and liberal constitutional capitalism were essentially the same. One was liberal to the extent one adopted or effectively mimicked England's features. The nation state, capitalist industrialization, the gold standard, parliamentary democracy, and free trade. The same was true much more recently in history for Moscow and communism. Despite the fact that it lasted a relatively short time historically, Leninism and the Soviet Union qualify as world historical events. For a strategic and critical period of definitional institutional time, the Soviet Union was communism. It's true that almost simultaneous with the appearance of communism in the Soviet Union, it appeared in Outer Mongolia, but no one could find it. Moscow dogmatically, authoritatively, practically, and in good measure effectively defined and disciplined the practical meaning of what it meant to be a communist and a communist regime, the leading role of party cadres, rapid industrialization, most of all collectivization, the correct line, and the Soviet Union as the hierophantic manifestation of revolutionary socialism. Point. If globalization, this diffuse but real thing, is to become a practical, institutional, universal, political, economic, and social reality, then paradoxically, like Christianity, Islam, liberalism, Leninism, and even feudalism, which had at its core the Normans, needs a local or particular carrier able to authoritatively discipline and concretely define the constituent elements of a new post-national and post-industrial way of life. So can the United States do it? It is attempting to do it today. Let me look from a second perspective, comparatively. I don't want to compare the United States with Rome, or with Mecca, or with London, or with Moscow. I want to compare the United States foreign policy today with its position in the world after World War II. In the late 1940s, the United States powerfully and authoritatively, that is to say successfully, offered itself as the exemplar of and papal organizer of Western liberal capitalist democracy everywhere from Japan to Germany. It was the United States that not only restored capitalism, but gave it a mass element both culturally and politically, that created consumer societies. In effect, with local variations, the dominant paradigm, the dominant and relevant example were the practices and ideas of the United States. And it came off not just having more money, less devastation, it came from the charismatic sense of success that infused American leaders after the Second World War. Like Menestheus's men in the Aeneid, Americans were strengthened by success. America had the power because it felt and deserved the power. Japan and Western countries might have had socialist parties, communist parties, different welfare traditions, and marked ambivalence. toward the United States after the Second World War, but all of the authoritatively defining institutions and actions of the era were American. The IMF, all the O's, NATO, CENTO, CETO, the Marshall Plan, the Korean War, the reconstitution of Japan and Germany, and of course, the dollar. America in the post-war period was the political noun and verb. The rest of the Western world were the adjectives, the adverbs, and occasionally the object. In a most striking expression of American power, the United Nations, far from being located in neutral Switzerland, Ireland, or Sweden, was located in the Empire State, New York City. The fact is that the United States succeeded in creating an international, not global given the reality of the Soviet bloc, but an international political, economic, military, social, and cultural reality that it led and disciplined concretely and authoritatively for the post-war period. A very nice example being what happened to our allies in Suez when we told them to withdraw. The question now is what circumstances favored that development? What is it about the world that in that period of time allowed the United States not only to assert but effectively act on the premise that it was the concrete definition and authoritative standard of democratic capitalism in the world? First, and clearly, was a prostrate Western Europe. There was no one else in the West to contest what the West meant, what liberal capitalist democracy meant, what it meant. You had a prostrate Western Europe whose elites feared both the Soviet Union and also their domestic communist parties, particularly in France and Italy. Second, you had a largely docile non-European world, from Latin America to Africa, whose independence movements and communist insurgencies were until the 1960s of peripheral concern. The Hezbollah hops in the Philippines, and of course the Malaysian insurgency which the British defeated. Third, a victorious Soviet Union within a few years succeeded in creating a set of geographically contiguous replica regimes. It's an extraordinarily cute phrase, I think, if you give it some geographically contiguous set of replica regimes. That is to say, all around it, you had little Moscows, you had little Stalins, you had little corrupt courts. In fact, in the countries of the Soviet bloc, many members of the Communist Party went so far in their emulation of the Soviet Union that they divorced their wives and married Russians. If you look, the Soviet Union's creation of this bloc, of a set of replica regimes from Czechoslovakia to China, meant that the world could be shared. It wasn't the United States alone that had to try to discipline it. It couldn't if it attempted to. And so what you had was a division of labor. And the division of labor was aided by the fact that under Stalin, at least, the Soviet Union was a very cautious power, not because of character, but because of his own geostrategic considerations. The Cold War, in short, was a historical period marked by barricades. By the Iron Curtain, by the Bamboo Curtain, by the Berlin Wall itself. It was a world of sharp and well-known edges. Today, the circumstances surrounding a comparable attempt by the United States now not to conflate American liberal capitalism with the generic notion of liberal capitalist democracy, but rather to conflate and fuse the phenomenon of Americanization and globalization is attended by very different circumstances. And these circumstances, unlike those following World War II, appear to me to be more stumbling than building blocks. Missing most of all is the Soviet Union. Missing, not I wish to add, missed. Together, the United States and the Soviet Union were able to more or less, as I've said, discipline their respective areas of the world. There were exceptions, and they were just that. In contrast, also, the so-called Third World, which never even got a name, actually, it just made it to a number. And anyway, the non-Western world today is one of domestically and regionally blurred political margins. You can see it most manifestly in Africa, but you can see it elsewhere as well, namely a world of violently weak, porous points. It's no longer the case that the so-called Third World has two choices, to make believe they're Democrats or to make believe they're communists. And that's what most of the Third World did throughout the Cold War. They made believe. They were mimic regimes. They mimicked nation states by having airports, an airline, and a UN seat. They mimicked their various ideological sponsors. Somalis used to talk about scientific socialism. They were neither scientific nor socialist. But the fact of the matter is the existence of two worlds with power, economic, military, and political could in effect discipline the non-Western world to the point where it couldn't even experiment. Today it's not experimenting, it's disintegrating. So on the one hand, you have the absence of a disciplinary power of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, you have as a result of that, in part, the rapid disintegration and disarray within the third world, which is a source of what I've just defined, not defined, but described as violent weakness. But what about Europe? While one can find exaggerated statements about the alleged inexorable growth of EU political and economic power on the one hand, and its indelible military and political weakness on the other, no one can today consider the European Union prostrate. Even if politically or militarily ineffectual, the European protest against American foreign policy is politically articulate, vocal, and supported by their populations. Furthermore, there are two nuclear powers within the EU, and the last time I looked, a united Germany had not joined Ireland, Switzerland, and Sweden as a neutral power. In short, all of the circumstances that favored America's appropriation of a general role in history in the world after World War II are simply not available today, which doesn't mean the attempt is not being made. Let me add another circumstance that may work against the Bush administration or anybody else's. Clinton tried to do the same thing. The difference between Clinton and Bush is real. Clinton was Mother Teresa and George is Mother Superior. But basically, you're talking basically about the same thing. I mean, Clinton just thought he was a nice crude Marxist, and he thought that with a little economy, human rights, the world would basically become Indiana. And George thinks with a little more military muscle, it'll become Texas. But both basically have the same idea. You know, there's difference, and the differences are consequential. But don't believe that somehow or other John Kerry or anyone like him is going to go for the UN and make Kofi Annan the head of the United States. I mean, I can see making him the major model for Versace, but he is not going to be. He is not going to become the head. All Americans have this simultaneous notion of being a hermit and a missionary. Either we don't want anything to do with the world, or we want everything to do with it as long as it's like us. So if you look, I think there may be a circumstance in the world today, in addition to the changed nature of Western Europe, the absence of the Soviet Union, and the very changed character of the third world to the point where it's become not docile, not influential, but violently weak. There's another circumstance which may, and this is highly speculative, may be important. One must take seriously the possibility that the success of a new global project such as that of world religions, or a global project such as that of world secular ideologies, or a global project such as that of empire, that this new global project of globalization may in effect require a carrier radically different than anything we've seen in the past. You understand the initial point. The initial point was that if you're going to get a universal movement that is practical, not just discussed in the Milano, but that is actually going to have an impact on the world, it has to be monopolized in a concrete, definitional, and disciplinary sense by one particular character. Rome beats Hippo. London beats Amsterdam. The United States takes over from other capitalist countries. To date, there's two things I'm saying here. One is that globalization may be of such a nature that it is genuinely postmodern. And that means that it needs a local carrier, the nature and character, the outlines and profile, the definition of which we have no idea yet. Which is very upsetting for intellectuals, because having no power, having no money, and having no influence, they have to give you the right idea. But the idea isn't there right now. That's why Marxists have become film critics. They ran out of ideas. But think about it for a minute. Supposing that there generally is a thing out there called globalization, something that's going to make us members of something other than the nation state, something that's going to engage us in business or economic activities other than manufacturing. The fact is that no nation may be able to co-opt that, to appropriate it and define it, and so America's attempts in that direction are misplaced, not because we're imperialist or good or bad, but because we're the wrong type of carrier for a new type of global project. I want to make one more comment in this regard, because I want to make it clear that I think postmodernist theory is rubbish. Right? The notion that there will be no more disciplining defining center, that we have now moved into a world of multiple and relativistic ideas, and that the idea of hegemony is not only ethically unacceptable, but no longer possible in the world we live in information technology and all the rest, I think is absurd. There's no evidence for it. It is an analytically opaque and an intellectually self-indulgent statement, which leads basically to nihilism, both politically and, I think, theoretically. But enough of postmodern theory. My point here is that we may be in a literal postmodern situation in that globalization is going to require carriers of a nature that are as difficult to define as the nation state was in the 17th century. All right. These differences in global circumstances at the end of World War II and the Cold War, I think, have a strategic and political significance. It is not the significance that is usually referred to when academics get together. They're always looking for a chance to use Marx's statement in the 18th Brumaire, where he refers to Hegel's observation that all great historical events occur twice. Marx went then on to note in the 18th Brumaire that Hegel forgot to add, the first time these historical events occur, they're tragic, the second time they're farcical. America's efforts after World War II were not tragic, they were majestic. Its efforts today are not farcical, but they are mundane. To put it bluntly, efforts by the Bush administration to conflate Americanization and globalization by way of a war against terrorism predicated on American-led imposed democratic regime changes will not only fail, they will likely damage our liberal Republican Constitution. Currently, attention is primarily directed at the difficulties facing the United States in its efforts to create a democratic constitutional capitalist regime in Iraq, and with good reason. I believe any successes in this direction will be indecisive, superficial, based on continuing military force, in short, fragile. For additional reading, I suggest you look at our recent experiences in Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Afghanistan. Let me suggest why we're going to fail in this effort in Iraq and in most other places where we try. Morally, the best kind of war you want to fight is a short war. Furthermore, short wars are fine if the goal is limited to a change in political elites and their apparatus, which is what the goal should have been in Iraq. However, if you want to bring about major social and political changes like democracy, and you don't get major political changes without social changes, then the best kind of war is a long and violent one fought on the ground. Because the longer and more violent the war, and this is where political leaders can't be monks, ethics of a religious order and political ethics are different. Weber wasn't the first, he was the most profound in his statement about it. If you want to change a social system from one which generates malignant types of regimes, you don't want a short moral war. You want a long, violent war because they're more likely to disrupt, to disorganize, to disintegrate, or destroy the existing institutional bases of identification in a society that tolerates or generates that type of malignant regime. By having a major form of disruption and disintegration, you free people up. You socially mobilize them in the sense that they are available in good numbers for new loyalties, new psychologies, and new memberships. Democratic regime change a la the Bush Doctrine is so far off the mark because it does two things. First, it combines an uncritical enthusiasm for technology and techniques with an invincibly ignorant position on the sociology and anthropology of the countries it's dealing with. How many of you here are married to your first cousins? How many? Well, in West Virginia, to be higher, but the point is that over 50% of Iraqis are married to the first cousin, including Saddam Hussein. What does that tell you? It tells you something about the relative availability of loyalty to the nation state. And if you don't have loyalty to the nation and the state, it's a little hard to get democracy. When your loyalties are reduced and conflated into the family, where the family is the concrete expression of your political and religious loyalties, what you have is a society that is ultimately fragmented. And to go into that society and assume you're going to have the free-floating political loyalties and resources to create an Iraqi civil civic democracy is not only an act of faith, it would depend on a social miracle. It's bad enough that for over a decade, political scientists have ignored sociocultural realities in their so-called theories of transition. It is much worse and consequential when the American government follows their lead. If an error is to be made to rid the world, in the effort to rid the world of unusually dangerous regimes, and I'll tell you what an unusually dangerous regime is. It's not one that simply presents a clear and present, it's one that presents a clear and persistent danger. I think the Bush administration was absolutely right to go to war in Iraq. And it was absolutely right to go to war in Iraq for two reasons. One, the leadership was not the type I prefer in the third world, corrupt and authoritarian. If it was a corrupt and authoritarian, they're wonderful people to deal with. You just buy them off. Mubarak, Abdullah, you name it. I don't care if they're in Latin America, the Middle East, anywhere. If the chances are not democracy or totalitarianism, but totalitarianism of a sort and a corrupt authoritarian regime, in the real world, you don't read Plato's Republic, you read the laws. You take second best. Saddam Hussein was a committed true believer in Michel Aflaq's pan-Arabism. Michel Aflaq died in Baghdad. If he had been just a corrupt dictator, run-of-the-mill, he'd still be there, there'd be no problem. He had more money than Mobutu, he had better Cuban cigars, closer geographic access to Russian women. I mean, the fact of the matter is, there was nothing in the way of sustaining this man's rule. Why didn't he do it? Why didn't he do it? Peter, he's a coward, he crawled out of his hole. Baloney. He could be sitting there right now in 62 different palaces, bribing UN officials, getting oil for whatever he needs. Why didn't he do it? It would have been a rational choice for him to do this. Why risk it all? You know, why have to spend your whole day now reading the Quran? I mean, once a week is okay, but all day, that's the only thing he sits and reads all day. He did it because he happened to believe. Americans are very odd. They're the most Marxist people in the world. Americans believe that the only thing that really motivates people are economics, wealth, and power. What about belief? That's what motivated him. He was a clear and persistent danger. In any situation in which he could build weapons, which nobody else was building at the time, he'd do so. Whether it was at the beginning with these howitzers that were taller than the Empire State Building, from the time of trying to get nuclear technology. Now, there are other reasons he might have done it. And undoubtedly, everyone here disagrees with my belief that we should have invaded. But the point is, the invasion didn't depend on the existence of weapons of mass destruction. It depended on the existence of a leader who wanted to be the dictator of the Arab world, control resources, develop weapons, align himself with movements that I think we would not particularly enjoy confronting. I think our major mistake then was not to engage in surgical strikes. We should have gone in, destroyed him, killed him. He should not be in prison right now. He should be dead. He's a war criminal, and we're going to give him the equivalent of 3 years to make a mockery of justice the way we're doing Milosevic. But that's not my decision. My decision is that we should have recognized that the purpose of our invasion was to destroy this leader and his regime and then get out. Not to stay. Let me back up. Not to go in with the belief that there was a mystical civil society over there of Jeffersonian citizens waiting to come out to congratulate us, a la Normandy, for the marvelous liberating effect, because, and here's what really makes me laugh, is that the Republican administration is now more politically correct. Nobody's more politically correct than Berkeley, but as politically correct as Berkeley. Here's the administration's political correctness. You cannot possibly say that any society in the world is not immediately ready for democracy or you're a racist. So Yemen, why not have democracy tomorrow? No problem whatsoever. How about Outer Mongolia? I have some people in my former department telling me it's a democracy. They can't find each other. There's only 1.5 million of them out there in this huge, there's more dinosaurs than Mongols in Outer Mongolia. What am I trying to get at? You're getting what is a very misleading, reckless, and irresponsible position by the Bush administration that says you cannot possibly criticize the notion that some cultures are not currently defined and organized in a way that is receptive to democracy. That's not the same thing as saying people aren't able to have democracy. There's no genetic predisposition to have democracy. I mean, the West wasn't democratic for most of its history. It wasn't industrial, it wasn't scientific, it wasn't developed. In fact, if you came from Mars in the 14th century, you looked down at the Earth and you said, where's the growth spot in the world for individual liberty, freedom, capitalist development, technological, scientific development? You'd say China. I mean, if you saw Northwestern Europe, you'd see this little foggy fragment of the Eurasian continent that was characterized at the time by bad weather, bad food, and bad teeth. And that's where you got the growth. So it obviously isn't genetic. You know, all you have to do is watch the movie Shogun. We got there, and the Japanese, first thing they said was, you smell. You know, not that you're dangerous or you're going to contaminate, you just smell. If you look, I think that these misguided utopian and evangelical attempts to bring about the political rapture in the form of a democratic revolution, and the slogan of the Bush administration is, this is to be a global democratic revolution, and this century will be the age of liberty. I think that this is going to, efforts that act on this belief will fail to create democracies. That's number one. Second, will lead to a potentially unending series of unsuccessful military operations in the world that I think will be, at one and the same time, inadequately ruthless militarily. We should have leveled Fallujah, prematurely democratic, and certainly unpopular in the United States. It will also, this type of Bush evangelical policy is going to produce more than its share of political embarrassments for America in the world, like the one we currently experience in our relation with North Korea, which according to the Bush Doctrine, we should have attacked before Iraq. Our actions in the world to create democracy all over, a la Texas, I think is also going to contribute to a growing perception in the world that the United States not only acts unilaterally, but that we act irrationally. And to the perception among Americans, including myself, that our current foreign policy directly threatens our conservative Constitution. To return to an earlier point, historically, those political, religious, military, or economic entities that successfully lay claim to the initial and practical definition of a movement with global potential invariably do so dogmatically, arrogantly, and aggressively. They don't do so with humility. Despite their different and opposed rationales, beliefs, and practices, as well as their organization, Roman Catholicism, Arabic and Ottoman Islam, British liberalism, and Moscow Center all fit that pattern. There is an ethos about success of an extraordinary nature, and that ethos is one that is generally characterized by and generates arrogance and aggression. Each of these history-shaping entities defines itself in its relationship to the world in both castle and crusader terms, and simultaneously generated violent external confrontations and internal corruption. The United States may well be following this imperial path without enjoying the corresponding success of previous empires. The greatest danger, I think, that radical imperial ventures pose to this country is the type of regime change we might suffer. It would be perverse, not ironical, that if in our efforts to create democratic regime change in North Korea, we ended up becoming North Korean and adopting its goal of autarky in the world. One only has to assume the following: the eventual development of a credible nuclear missile defense program, a more effective homeland security program, more diverse energy sources and types of energy, maintenance of our current military R&D programs, and an international environment in which for a critical period of future time there remains no effective military or ideological competitor. That would lead to a world, in my mind, a world in which America would be more militarized and a world less democratized. In the near future, the United States, and this is worth considering, in the near future, the United States may not have to choose between riding out to proselytize others and hiding out to sterilize ourselves from contact with contaminating cultures. Our power may become such ideologically, militarily, and economically that we will be truly a Christian nation, namely in this world, but not of it. To be successful, American foreign policy must add a banquet orientation to its fortress orientation. In the West, that means America's growing appreciation. It's not growing. What should be a growing appreciation of Europe's new status, of the EU's reality and potential vis-a-vis the United States. It means making NATO's leadership more ecumenical and less of a papal American one. It means that the EU economic fortress should be redesigned to invite us to their economic banquet. It means more allies and fewer clients. Most of all, It means in a world of wildcat violence that includes civil war, state disintegration, aggression by one country against another, stateless movements of raids like Al-Qaeda, all of which may at some point involve weapons of mass destruction, that the United States must reject as the basis of its foreign policy all one-dimensional doctrines, such as the war against terrorism and all one-dimensional strategies, regime change in favor of a foreign policy that is less elegant, but rests on a more effective set of strategic repertoires. In Schumpeter's words, what we need is a foreign policy that is less vivid, but more efficient. And those repertoires should rest on a trinity of premises. I always believe you should have three of everything. If you're a Jew or a Muslim, you should have one, because Jews and Muslims are genuine monotheists, Christians fake it. With 3 and 1, I've never understood it, but Sister Consolata told me that's the way it was, and I've gone with it ever since. America's foreign policy should rest on a trinity of premises. First, and this is not pablum. This is the sort of thing that has to be remembered from time to time in the history of any country if it's remained true to its origins. America's greatness rests in the first instance on individual liberty, not military power. When it comes to imposed regime changes, we should listen to Madison, not Machiavelli. Madison, who in 1792 pointed out something absolutely brilliant, namely that in the past, charters of liberty have been granted by power. America has set the example of charters of power being granted by liberty. Imposition of democracy doesn't seem to square with that. Second premise, democratic republics like the United States depend on checks and balances. I would suggest to you that that is becoming equally true internationally, not just within the American political system itself. The task of creating a legitimate authoritative pattern of checks and balances within an expanded Western world that includes the EU and the United States and Canada, I think, is going to be one of the defining political challenges of our age. And finally, and perhaps at base most important, American foreign policy should always be more Augustinian than Pelagian. Nobody knows who Pelagius is, which if I were at Berkeley here, I could say was a statement of racism, because he's Irish and completely neglected. Actually, it's very odd. He's the only Irish figure in history I know that was also an optimist. But if you look at Pelagius, what Pelagius says is the following. Pelagius says that man's perfectible. Augustine said, I'm sorry, original sin, you got to put up with the fact that human beings are fallible. They're good, but they're fallible. The United States follows a Pelagian policy. The world can be perfect. It can be Texas. It could be California. It could be Marin County. Yeah? It gets funnier and funnier. The point simply is that we don't want a Pelagian foreign policy. We want an Augustinian policy that says change is real, change is possible, change is marginal, peripheral, and only in cataclysmic circumstances entailing violence that we should be ambivalent of does it really create major types of changes. The United States would be well advised to realize that, to my memory, only one entity created the world in his own image, that was God. Whether or not he exists, the United States is not God. Listen in conclusion, and in this same vein, to Bernard Bailyn, I consider our greatest contemporary historian. American constitutionalism is not a theory to be debated or a model to be imitated, let alone imposed, but a reserve of experience, exemplary of good or ill, a reserve that can be drawn on when needed intermittently, selectively, with emphases that are shaped differently by the distinctive problems of different societies in different modes and at different stages of transformation. Thank you for inviting me.
2 years ago, I heard you speak on during the run-up to the Iraqi war, and you were saying how eloquent and savvy and competent Rumsfeld and Cheney were after 9/11 and running up to the war, and you believed in preemptive action at the time. What happened?
I believe what?
In preemptive action.
Oh, yeah.
And you believed in Rumsfeld, and you believed in Cheney, and you thought they were competent businessmen, and that turned
I never believed in Cheney's, what I always considered and published before the war, So you can look at it in policy review if you wish. So I'm on the record as always having opposed this, I think, sort of eschatological fervor of changing the world in favor of democracy. I favor preemptive war, yeah. And that's what I said about the clear and persistent danger. I think the Israelis were absolutely right to bomb the atomic or nuclear plant in Iran when they saw it was being built. That was preemptive. Furthermore, and this isn't any support for the argument of preemptive action, but we've engaged in preemptive actions throughout our history. So the issue is not preemption per se, and let me make another point about this pointed and useful question, is that we did not preempt, we anticipated. In other words, what we did was much more radical than preemption. Preemption is if you know the other guy's got the weapons that can hit you and you don't wait for him to use them, you go get him first. And you particularly do that if he doesn't have a second strike, so that after you hit him, he has nothing to come back with you with and you destroy him. We did something much more radical. We went in on the belief that at some point, if he had the occasion, he would get those weapons. That, again, I refer you to my article, not only because it's good, but because I don't have to repeat it, and it's called Rage, Hubris, and Regime Change, and I speak exactly to this. But I have never, ever thought highly of Cheney's somewhat, or rather very shrill understanding of what the mission of the United States is. I continue to admire Rumsfeld's intellect and ability. I just think he doesn't understand that societies, he's a bit of what Mao would call a paper tiger. He's like McNamara. He's too much into techniques. You know, if you have a global positioning system, that's going to win a war when some 16-year-old who's on hashish has an AK-47 that he bought for $100 and is killing you. So I think he's misguided in the types of considerations he brings to this, and that Shinseki was right. We should have gone in with many more troops. But I haven't got much to say for Cheney at all.
Thank you, Professor. I just had a question. You said you supported killing Saddam Hussein and this strategy of preventive war. How do you reconcile that with your call for a more, as you call it, humility in globalization and sort of a more ecumenical kind of globalization when we're violating international law? Yeah.
International law doesn't amount to very much, particularly during war. It's not that I'm against international law, it's just that it's mostly a figment. Having a more humble role in the world doesn't in any way contradict the notion that once you go to war, you try to destroy your enemy. You don't go into Fallujah, where there is a major concentration of forces hostile to you that are the very reason you went to war in the first place, and tell your Marines who are getting shot at to turn it over to the very people who hate you. It's as if the United States Army went into Nazi Germany and the way to win World War II, and we got to Nuremberg, and a whole bunch of people said, well, wait, you can't attack Nuremberg. It's a holy city for we Nazis. Basically, you have to leave this one alone. Just go along, and we'll let a local SS guard take care of it. I really don't think we would have done that, and we shouldn't have done this. And that's why the democratic premises of this invasion are continuing to have enormous negative practical effects. Because we're afraid of losing the hearts and minds of people who are cutting our hearts out and cutting our heads off, we're worried about going in and destroying Fallujah. There should be no Fallujah today. Not because of any cocky chicken hawk talk on my part as someone who's never been in a war, but if you go to war, that's the understanding. You destroy the enemy. We went in as basically half-hearted, and we're suffering the results right now. Yes?
You said that trying to engage civil society in Iraq is pretty much a non-starter.
Right.
How about trying to engage Islamic civil society in the European Union?
What is it? What's the reference? I know what the European Union is, but what is Islamic civil society?
Muslims in Europe.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Who could be against it? I mean, basically what they should do is what the British have done, arrest those who speak in terrorist terms, like al-Masri, put them in jail or get rid of them, and do everything possible to encourage membership in the existing political parties, representation in parliament on the part of Muslims who are willing in some minor way to assimilate to society. It's very difficult to deal with immigrants if immigrants come with the idea that they're there to live but not to be loyal to the place they live. It's like the difference between 4th Street and 4th of July. A number of people in Berkeley love 4th Street more than they love the 4th of July. It doesn't mean that everybody in Berkeley doesn't love America. I'm sure some do. The point The point simply is that there's a difference. There's a difference between living in a society that you benefit from, contribute to, enjoy, but get embarrassed when you have to stand, for the flag. The fact of the matter is immigrants in any country, if they're going to immigrate to that country, I think have a basic commitment and duty to become part of that political community, as critical as they wish. Absolutely as critical as they wish. No question about that whatsoever. In fact, they should be, or they wouldn't be citizens. But the notion of just living there and saying, I'm not changing a thing, I'm not learning your language, I'm not learning your civic code, what are you doing here? One more question, then I need a drink.
You said that one of the dangerous things about Saddam Hussein was that he operated on belief rather than rationality. Would you say the same thing about our president?
I think if you just look at psychology, there's something to that, yes. I think the consequences are slightly different. Saddam Hussein didn't operate in a democratic polity where there were checks and balances. You couldn't elect him out of power. He would shoot you. He led a movement that was made up of true believers and careerists. He didn't have to face John Kerry. He would have killed John Kerry. John Kerry would not be having another Purple Heart. He'd be dead. And so when you say, does Bush have certain psychological traits, a true believer, evangelical Christian, God called me for a mission, I think undoubtedly there's something to that, but that its political effect is marginalized as opposed to centralized in the case of Saddam Hussein. Thank you all again.